Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome. I am Margelle Hyatt, excuse me, the Administrative Director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program at JHU SAIS. And I want to welcome everyone to one of the Energy Resources and Environment, ERE's special lectures. We are delighted to welcome Robert Gurman with us today. He is a consultant at Proenergy Consulting, and near and dear to our heart, he is also a SAIS grad, and we're delighted to welcome him today to discuss commercial fleet electrification and financing structures. I'm going to ask everyone who would like to ask a question to just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, let me turn this over to Robert for an exciting presentation.
Thank you, Margelle. Welcome to all who are participating in this Zoom presentation. First and foremost, I hope that everybody is safe and healthy and adjusting to our new way of life, but most importantly, everybody's safe and healthy. A couple of introductory remarks, and the first is the most obvious, that the whole world has been affected by COVID-19 and electrification, which is still in its relative infancy, despite tremendous progress over the last 5-10 years. It's certainly going to be affected. Throughout this presentation, you'll see projections. These were made for the most part in 2019, and so of course any projection that is here has got to be taken with a grain of salt under the current circumstances. Also, in this change of form, originally I was scheduled to present this in person at SAIS in March, but changing to this virtual approach. I'm cutting a couple of elements from the presentation. I won't talk too much about the international side, but I certainly do want to emphasize that over the course of the presentation, to the extent that you have questions or want to delve into anything that I'm passing over relatively quickly, please send in your question and deeper thing. The introductory comment I'd like to make is I just want to draw a distinction between what we're talking about today, commercial fleets and passenger EVs. I'm sure most of you, if you're familiar with electric cars, you're more familiar with it at the passenger level. That's an important driver to the business. But for the most part, people buy cars based on more emotional aspects than economic aspects. Of course, how much you could afford and things like that. But the passenger EV market, the passenger car market in general, is very different than commercial fleets. And we'll talk about some of those distinctions, but we will be focusing on commercial fleets today in particular. So I'd like to get right into it. There are three key stakeholder groups in commercial fleet adoption. The first are the fleet operators, and these are the companies that operate delivery vans, trucks, UPS, IKEA, things like that, transit and school buses, but as well, they are the delivery companies that you see all the time, and this includes heavy-duty equipment as well. For example, the baggage tugs and other vehicles that you see on the tarmac at airports, that's a category, a very important electrification category called GSE, ground service equipment. And this also includes everything from sanitation trucks to bulldozers. There are electric models all across the range for electric vehicles. Many of the operators who are looking to electrify their fleets are very, very interested, but they're not convinced yet that the other two stakeholder groups, the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, and the charging infrastructure developers can meet their needs for large-scale electrification. And in this process, why financing is so critical is that in the traditional area of commercial fleets, these operators, from Pepsi to IKEA to Waste Management to Verizon and even your local utility, they rarely own their own fleet. In fact, they are, it's more efficient for them to use their own capital and balance sheet to lease these trucks, which converts the capital expense, which comes from either high cost equity or a drag on the balance sheet in the form of debt, to an operating expense. And just to put this in context, some of these nationwide fleets are extremely large. AT&T has 69,000 vehicles in its fleet. Pepsi has 62,000. Comcast has 37,000, and so on and so forth. The OEMs, these are the manufacturers of electric trucks. They need huge amounts of capital to rapidly scale production. However, again, the capital intensity is certainly there, but the capital markets are not convinced that these OEMs can secure robust contracts for a production, for them to invest the money into scaling up their factories, their operations. However, capital has been flowing into this sector, and over time we'll see that hopefully they will be able to scale up to meet the needs of the fleet operators. In commercial vehicles, the Europeans and the Chinese are ahead of the American manufacturers. Some of these companies are Arrival, which is a UK company that's expanding to the United States. Volvo, Daimler, the maker of trucks. There are several Chinese companies, BYD. But also are some American companies. I'm sure you've all heard of Tesla. Tesla makes a semi-tractor trailer that's still in testing. XOS and Rivian are additional names. Amazon has invested in Rivian a huge amount of capital along with Ford, and expects to, and has announced an order for 100,000 Rivian trucks for deliveries beginning in 2021. We'll see if that actually comes about, though. Charging infrastructure providers, that's the third key stakeholder group. And these are the companies that are trying to install charging, which is a much more, in the commercial fleet sector, this is a much more stylized and custom-made approach. Fleet operators have very, very specific needs. This is not the case, such as in passenger EVs, where you can hang a charger in your garage, or you can put 2 or 3 on the edge of a hotel or shopping mall parking lot. This is a much, much more specific approach, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on in the presentation. But also of great importance is that the charging infrastructure side is very scary for the operators themselves because it's very new. It's much more complicated than requiring gas or diesel fuel for your fleet. And if something is complicated, then it's risky, and corporate CFOs do not like risk. Some of the questions for charging operators are, for fleet operators, are own or outsource, require from the OEM, or provide separately in a separate procurement, dealing with the local utility. All of these are very, very complicated issues that are new to fleet operators, their operating management and their financial management. So what we have is a commercial EV market that finds itself in a three-dimensional chicken and egg situation where each of these stakeholder groups certainly is committed to large-scale electrification, but not 100% convinced that each of the other two groups will be able to demonstrate the same scale and commitment. What we do find in this market is a significant amount of early stage activity. There are tons of tests and pilots that are going on. New models of electric commercial vehicles are coming out on a regular basis. Different tests for different type of charging technologies and different types of battery and electric vehicle deployments. Because of all of the innovation, new business models are being developed in many, many different ways. People are trying to decide, should I own, should I finance, can I get financing, what risks do I want to take, who's going to take various other risks. And in all of this, and as we've discussed, capital and financing is extremely important. Financial investors have not yet really dived into this sector, but they're watching closely, watching the early movers, and for the most part, the investors are strategic investors. In other words, other industry participants who are making small investments to get a seat at the table at some of the smaller and innovative constituents in this sector. There are lots of drivers motivating commercial EV fleet adoption, broadly divided into these 5 categories. We're going to talk about 2 and 3 in a little bit of detail, but just to touch on the others, technology, there's tremendous innovation, technology innovation that's going on, both in terms of the guts of these vehicles, particularly battery development, as well as charging infrastructure. And as well, I've mentioned all different models are coming out of the vehicles and being applied to new areas of vehicle electrification all the time. Jumping down to number 4, policy support. This is a very, very open issue at this point because how electrification gets treated in subsequent federal stimulus bills is certainly open at this point, but states and lobby groups, industry lobby groups, are certainly working the halls of Congress right now as these next fiscal stimulus bills are being developed. Also, at the states level, which are big drivers for EV adoption programs around the country, because of the tremendous costs of fighting the coronavirus at the state level and huge budget deficits, it's really unknown and unknowable at this point how state-funded electrification programs will emerge 3 months, 6 months, 12 months from now in competition effectively with all of the other priorities as the states come out of the coronavirus situation. Private sector support. So as I said at the outset, commercial electrification is still effectively in its infancy. We have some large players and a lot of startups. So in my reach out to industry constituents over the last month, 6 weeks, some are moving full steam ahead and continuing with their business as well as they can. Others, the smaller ones, the startups, are basically in survival mode. So how the private sector will emerge in commercial electrification certainly remains to be seen. Now we'll talk about a couple of the drivers, particularly costs. There is significant R&D investment and innovation in the sector, and this suggests that overall EV costs will follow the declining cost curves of solar, wind, and other clean energy technologies. And we certainly see it in battery costs, and the expectation is that that downward cost trajectory will continue, and battery costs make up about 40% of an electric vehicle's costs. Passenger EVs have been moving along to cost parity, but again, as I said, where the car manufacturers will be 3 months, 6 months from now, as they face huge decline in their core businesses, is still to be seen. Commercial electric vehicles and electric buses. In certain duty cycles, we can see either currently or very much in the near future that these will be on a comparable cost basis to equivalent internal combustion engines. The concept, the primary metric in this respect is TCO, or total cost of ownership. And this is something that is very, very calculable. Commercial and electric commercial vehicles and buses have fairly predictable duty cycles and routes. And so the operators know pretty much down to the penny what their costs are now with internal combustion engines. And the only variables are volatility in fuel costs. You can do the same thing with electric vehicles, projecting out, again, what those costs will be down to the mile to come up with a total cost equivalent, total cost of ownership equivalent. However, one of the things that is different is that electricity rates are very much locally driven, depending upon the local utility and also the local regulatory environment. And so these are additional wrinkles to the TCO model that any operator has to incorporate into calculations. How am I doing on time? Okay. The second driver is sustainability. And here it's very, very important to understand that this is a major driver for the commercial sector. UPS, for example, IKEA, PepsiCo, these are all consumer-facing businesses. We see on our city streets, on the highways, UPS trucks, Pepsi trucks, things like that. And we see them rolling up to our doors for deliveries. These companies themselves realize that currently they're rolling up to our doors with loud, dirty, emission-spewing or clean, and know that a very, very important factor for them to demonstrate their environmental or green bona fides is to have electric trucks or zero emission or low emission trucks. So UPS in particular is one of the leaders in this respect, is looking to electrify its fleet. Most of the other consumer delivery services as well. So in this respect, sustainability and reputation are linked, and electrification for these companies is a very visible and a marketable solution. However, despite these drivers, there are significant barriers to full-scale commercial EV fleet adoption. I'll just touch on a couple of them here. Lack of charging infrastructure. If any of you do follow just the passenger EV market and have an electric vehicle yourself, you know that if you want to take anything more than a local trip, you have to think about it. You have to plot out where the charging infrastructure is along a 200, 500, let's say, cross-country trip. But it's more than likely that you would be able to, with a bit of planning, know that there's charging infrastructure along the way. That is not yet the case for long distance, long haul, what's referred to as point A to point B travel in the commercial sector. So that's a factor. Immature supply chain, as previously mentioned, this three-dimensional chicken and egg problem. Each of the main stakeholders is concerned that there will be all of the other pieces that they need to the puzzle. If I commit to electrification, will I be able to get enough trucks? Will the truck manufacturer be able to get enough batteries? Will the charging infrastructure guy be able to get enough of the charging stations, and so on and so forth? As we've mentioned, availability of financing. This is a very, very capital intensive sector. And so if you're a corporate CFO or CEO thinking about electrification, in addition to all of these other barriers, you just have to ask yourself, can I get financing to make this transition? And as you ask yourself, can I get financing? There are several things to keep in mind. As I mentioned, a lot of the sector is in startup or demonstration mode, so it's higher risk. Capital is flowing to the sector, but it's primarily in the form of venture capital or strategic equity. The capital markets are generally not open for financing here. As I mentioned, financial investors such as private equity, while watching this sector closely, have not yet jumped in. Valuation is a big challenge, as both the metrics and comparable transactions are virtually non-existent. I'll give you an example. A British company called Arrival, they recently raised $150 million from 2 Asian investors and UPS. Their valuation was $3 billion. So if I'm an investor looking at this market, I think, okay, well, those are some big names and that's a big valuation, so that's interesting. But when you drill down, as I have, I've spoken to Arrival, their first commercial on-the-road tests will not be until the first half of 2021. So if I'm an investor and I'm seeing a $3 billion company that doesn't yet have a product on the road, I have to scratch my head and say, how did we get to that valuation? The bottom right, the ideal investment. So what I've done and what many people are doing in this sector on the commercial and financial side is reaching out to investors, infrastructure investors, those interested in ESG type of investments, and asking them, if you were to participate in the commercial sector, if you were to deploy capital on a large scale, what would be the criteria that you would use? What type of return metrics? What type of contractual underpinnings, and so on and so forth. And this is really still a work in progress. Project financing is something that is being contemplated widely in this sector in a particular application for EV fleet depot charging. And in this, the basic acronym is CaaS, or Credit Charging as a Service. Depot charging lends itself to project finance for the following reasons. The operators themselves can provide very predictable charging times and requirements for their specific fleets. The charging infrastructure can then be designed on a very customized and precise basis, so there's no waste in terms of the capital equipment deployment. The revenues can be very well predicted and undertaken through a contract. The fleet operator will sign a contract long-term, paying one price per month for the charging service for a long-term period, 7, 10, hopefully longer than that. With the predictable charging patterns, the load requirements can be defined, and so you can make most efficient your charging times and therefore your electricity rates. And from all of that, a financial model can be constructed and put this into a package with a credit-worthy operator and make it a power purchase agreement like PPA-like construct that forms the basis of a financing from a commercial lender and a equity investor. So for charging as a service, it provides an attractive approach for investors. All of the risk can be identifiably mitigated and provide a known and attractive return. Lenders as well will see all the risks mitigated. The long-term contractual nature is very important, so the lender sees a well-structured project to finance. And for the customer, the fleet operator, in this transition to electrification, they see fixed costs, which the CFO likes, and it's all taken care of for a long period of time. Are we okay on time, Margot? Okay, a few more slides. In terms of the fundamental contract that the charging station developer and the fleet operator will sign, it's got to have a couple of key components that make it financeable. Utilization commitment, this is going to be very, very important. The operator, let's say UPS at a particular depot, because of the predictable duty cycle of their trucks, they say that we're going to utilize X number of megawatts or X number of hours of charge every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Term minimum, the bottom left, we're going to do that for 10, 15 years. So we as the operator are going to sign up for this service, committing to a fixed amount of minimum utilization every day for a long period of time. The developer of the charging infrastructure will manage the electricity rates, and that will be taken care of so that the fleet operator simply pays the one price every month or whatever period's determined. We have to ensure that there is the physical space within a depot for the charging infrastructure and that it doesn't interfere with the rest of the operator's operations. The operator hopefully is a credit-worthy entity, and we also have to ensure, as is the case in most long-term commercial contract, that there are discernible security and liquidated damages provisions. In terms of the approach to fleet EV financing, it is a viable market, although, as we've said, it's still in its infancy. And so what I have here is a very, very summary chart of some of the market participants. The OEMs, there are more and more every day. I could make this list 20, 30, 40, 50 names. The OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the charging infrastructure providers, the fleet operators. So those are the three primary stakeholder groups, but as you've picked up through this, the investor-owned utilities are a very important part of this overall ecosystem, and some of them are getting into the business of being charging infrastructure developers themselves. The products and services for financing, we've talked about the project finance approach to charging as a service, but from a financial markets perspective, there's everything from investment banking, financial advisory, and M&A advisory to capital markets, not yet opened up, but the debt products certainly are being discussed in many circles, and that can be across inventory and asset-based, vehicle financing, purchases, fleet acquisition, or lease. And now there are some innovative structures for vehicles where the battery itself is being financed separate from the rest of the vehicle, because the battery life and the rest of the vehicle life are different. The battery cost is so much significant that it can be financed separately. And then the capital provider base, as I mentioned, strategic investors are very much present at this point. Financial investors, not so much, but a few of these companies that I mentioned here, I've spoken to. I know they're interested in the sector, but they have not yet really dived in. That concludes my presentation. I think we're on time. And I guess I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Sure. Robert, thanks very much. That was such an interesting presentation. I have just a few questions. And again, let me remind people, if you have anything that you'd like to ask Robert, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. One question I have is there a national policy on commercial fleet electrification? Is it are people talking about this? Where does that stand?
That's a very good question. There really is not a national policy. As I'm sure SAIS students certainly know, the administration under Donald Trump has not been very supportive of anything to do with clean energy or climate change or any initiative like that. So there is no national policy, but there is a tremendous amount of activity at the state level. And that's where things are being driven. In particular, as can be expected, California and New York State are both leaders in promoting fleet electrification.
Thanks. So a follow-on to this is, what is the impact of domestic emission standards on commercial fleet electrification? So you mentioned the Trump administration, and we've had some weakening of standards there. How is that pushing or not pushing or affecting the fleet electrification?
Yeah, that's very much a wild card at this stage. Before the virus hit, it certainly was unknown whether California's emissions levels would carry the day that many states sign up to, or the weakening federal standards would hold sway. Frankly, it's just open at this point as to which one will ultimately emerge as the leader. But that probably won't stop certain progressive states and in particular cities from trying to limit emissions. For example, New York City independently is working on a variety of initiatives that will lower the emissions of trucks, and they may not always be able to enact it by simply limiting emissions. There may be legal challenges to that, but localities can certainly do things to make it easier for low vehicle operators, parking, providing charging, providing lots of other benefits and incentives to the low emission vehicles that internal combustion engines, diesel engines simply would not qualify for. So it makes life more difficult for them.
Thank you. So following on, just do rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft, are they supportive of this?
They are, but that's a real challenge because of their business models. And I'm not expert on this, but the business model of a company like Uber is it's really at its core the software engine for the rideshare business, but each of the cars are independently owned. So from an electrification standpoint, it's not like Uber can say, over the next 3 years, we're going to convert our 50,000 Uber sedans to electric, because there are 50,000 independent owner operators. And so they themselves have to make the commitment. But again, going back to some of the state and local initiatives, I know for a fact that New York State and New York City are developing programs to make it more attractive for those companies, for the Lyfts, the Ubers, the rideshare companies, to transition to electric by providing them incentives, providing them with preferential positions in certain parts of their jurisdictions.
Great, thanks. You mentioned that electric utilities are a key stakeholder. What are some of the best characteristics or practices of good examples of utilities and fleet operators working together to enable fleet electrification?
The easiest example is in California, where the state regulators have said to the utilities that on a pilot basis, if you, the utility, take all the costs for the charging infrastructure, we'll let you put that into rate base. And that makes it very hospitable. There are a couple of pilot depot projects where the utilities, Southern California Edison, PG&E, have said, okay, we'll put in 50 charging stations, Mr. UPS, Mr. IKEA. If you bring your electric trucks into this depot, the utility will take care of everything for you. That's a very, very easy way to approach it. But the flip side of that is there are a couple of aspects to that to be considered. The first is that it doesn't demonstrate that there's really a commercial model there. Basically, the regulators are saying, we'll pay for all the electrification. And so it is, of course, it's attractive, but we don't learn anything commercially. And then the second thing is from a social justice standpoint or environmental equity, it socializes the cost for that one particular depot operator into the rate base of the entire utility.
Great, great, thank you. Where do the batteries from the for the electrifying these vehicles come from, and how vulnerable is the development to trade tensions? I mean, is that a part of this whole equation?
Oh yes, it's very much a part of the trade equation. For the most part, the batteries come from Asia. From China, from Korea. Those are the two primary sources, although obviously, as people probably know, Tesla makes its batteries here, but uses a lot of Asian components. So that is a potential problem down the road. However, we certainly have benefited from that up to this point because China has, over the past 5 years, really accelerated its overall investments in electrification. And so the demands for batteries and the scaling up of the demand for batteries have led to the lower prices, which we in the United States and Europe benefit from.
And somewhat related here, we have another question. I was wondering what your thoughts were on incorporating hydrogen FCEVs into the fleet electrification transition, given advantages in refueling time, size, and efficiency. How can governments work to encourage both technologies in electrifying the transportation sector?
Very good question, but unfortunately it's a little bit like, if any of you are old enough to remember this, the technology war between VHS and Betamax. Going back to, I think it was the 70s or 80s when video cassettes were the dominant form of, that certainly preceded CDs. So which technology, the market gets fractured. People have to invest one way or the other. They're not going to invest in both. And hydrogen, unfortunately, I think is in that same boat. It's less popular. It does for, whether it's deserved or not, there are a lot of concerns at the local level with fire protection. And so people are just concerned about fire safety with hydrogen station. It does have some technology advantages, but overall, I think my personal view is that it will, as batteries and electrification, pure electrification progresses, hydrogen will be relegated to a very small share of the market.
Great, thanks. Does organized labor support electrification? Where do we stand on some of the interest groups and their interest or non-interest in this?
Yeah, I think to this point, organized labor isn't really a factor, but except for one area, which is the Teamsters, the truckers union. However, their focus has been more, for obvious reasons, in opposition to autonomous vehicles. That obviously is a job killer for them, and so they're not very happy about that. As far as drivers go and electric trucks, I myself have asked drivers periodically, bus drivers, truckers, if they have any interest in electric trucks, and they're kind of indifferent. You know, a driver is driving one truck or another. They certainly, if they were concerned, they would be looking at charging time and things like that. But at the depot level, I think for local deliveries, truck drivers would be more appreciative of electric trucks. They're more reliable, they don't make any noise, and they don't emit any pollution.
Great. Does the oil price drop that we are experiencing now affect electrification efforts?
I think it will, but it's one of those things that is kind of unknown for the time being until we come out of this. Let's say up till 3 months ago, oil prices were not a big factor in the calculation of transitioning to commercial fleet electrification. It was a factor in the calculations of TCO, but I think, as I put it, if oil was at $2.75 a gallon, you could make an economic case for electrification. Obviously, the price has dropped significantly, and you know, and certainly hearing on a wholesale level that the price was negative. But I think these are components of volatility that won't last, but how they will play out as we come out of the virus and as the world economy restarts, it's just unknown.
Okay. Another question is, do you think you'll see more deployment without federal funding? You mentioned a potential inclusion in a new round of stimulus, but what if that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think the states will continue to advance this, and but as I did mention, there certainly will be budget battles to get people back to work, to get the economy started, and where do incentive programs for electrification fit in that? It's certainly unknown at this point. At the federal level, where it will be seen is there's a lot of funding for electrification and a lot of funding for, in general, for transit buses and school buses. And those are two areas where vehicle electrification really has a lot of potential. So whether those programs that provide funds specifically for electrification get cut back in future budget rounds and discussions, or whether they get enhanced, is an open question.
Okay. Well, that seems to be it for the questions. So unless I see anything else come in at the last minute, I want to thank you, Robert, for a really interesting presentation. It's very timely and certainly gives us something to think about during these long hours at home. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody for attending our ERE special lecture. Have a good afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you very much for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye.